Good morning and welcome to our first of 4 review lectures for APUS history. So what I've done here is I've created a review lecture focusing mostly on visuals, graphs, cartoons, and things like that to review our 9 units of APUS history. My goal is 20 minutes each. I've already kind of got my graphic organizer set up for all of them. So you can see I've split them up into 4 periods. Period 1 is 1491 to 1800, so kind of the creation of the early American Republic. Period 2 is the early republic and the road to the Civil War. Period 3 is kind of the creation of an American empire. And then period 4 will be more modern US history. And so we'll start with period 1, 1491 to 1800. This is units 1, 2, and 3. And from our AMSCO APUSH textbook, this is chapters 1 through 6. Starting first with European colonization. One of the most common questions, or one of the most common ways that I've seen this question asked, is to compare British and Spanish colonization. And so when we're looking at this map here, we see Spanish colonies in Latin America, South America, Central America, modern day Mexico. And then we see the English colonies along the Atlantic coast, what will become the 13 colonies, and then parts of Canada as well. You might want to remember for colonization, you might want to remember the motivations of the 3 Gs, God, glory, and gold. And oftentimes an interesting conversation of which one actually motivated these people more. For the Spanish, well, whatever. You could make an argument for any of them. I might say that the Spaniards were motivated more by gold. For England, a little bit of gold, a little bit of God, because when we dig into these 2 different colonial regions, Spain, they develop plantation economies. They oftentimes converted the native peoples of Latin America to Christians, forced them to convert to Christianity by force. I just said force twice, and treated them quite brutally. And so Spain, what they did is they were focused on extracting resources, gold, silver, especially. They forced the natives to convert to Christianity. You might remember the encomienda system that basically forced natives, basically forced labor. But there were eventual reforms after Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a monk essentially who wrote some criticisms of Spanish colonization. But Spain also, again, because they're focused on extracting resources, they don't have many permanent colonies. So England is much more focused on creating permanent colonies, permanent settlements with large populations. In the South, these are mostly plantation colonies for agriculture. And then kind of in the North and the Middle, especially, you have kind of many religious people persecuting religious discrimination. So settlers seek religious freedoms, let's just say. Puritans and Quakers especially, forms of Protestantism. And so when we're digging into the differences here, England focused much more on permanent settlements, so they had larger populations. England also, generally speaking, had a bigger focus on agriculture. We also have people seeking religious freedom. Whereas Spain, I would make the argument that Spain was much more about just stealing the resources and leaving. And then Spain also had that really brutal treatment of Native Americans. Not to say that the British treated the natives well, but in contrast. And then that brings us to the 13 colonies. The most common way that this question is asked on the AP exam is it asks you to compare and contrast different regions. And so you need to know New England, the middle colonies, and then the southern colonies. The southern colonies are sometimes broken up even more to describe the Chesapeake Bay, which would be Virginia and Maryland. But for now, we'll say New England, the middle colonies, and the South. New England is where we saw kind of our more established towns. You see a lot of people fleeing religious persecution there. So lots of Puritans settling there, Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts, for example. And because New England was very rocky, there was not very much fertile soil, you see more trade, fishing, shipbuilding, because there were a decent amount of forests um, in their colonies. So when we're talking about our different colonies, let's go New England, Middle, and South. The New England colonies, you oftentimes had larger towns. There was oftentimes a focus on religious freedom, and there was a focus on trade and shipbuilding because the land was not very fertile, not good for agriculture. The middle colonies was relatively similar in some respects to New England. You did have a lot of focus on religious freedom, especially in Pennsylvania, which granted religious toleration. Also, Maryland, I'll say Maryland did have the Act of Toleration. But a focus on religious freedom, a focus on trade. You can see a lot of similar economic activities. But the middle colonies also had a little bit more farming. Not as much as the middle colonies. They didn't have that perfectly fertile soil that New England, that the South did. But I'll say the middle colonies is somewhat similar to New England in that you have trade and shipbuilding. I'm going to say that there's a huge focus on religious freedoms. I'm going to say especially Pennsylvania, founded by the Quakers. And then the South is really where we see the biggest difference. Normally, when I see this question asked, it's asking you to compare northern colonies with southern colonies, perhaps comparing the middle colonies to the Chesapeake or New England colonies to the South. So knowing the North, not as fertile, not as much agriculture, big focus on religious freedom, versus the South is all about plantations, all about large scale farms. There are some people seeking religious freedoms here, especially in Georgia, I believe. But oftentimes you have people who are looking for gold, who are escaping debt, kind of a little bit of a rougher crowd in the South. So we have very fertile soil, leads to slave-based plantations, tobacco, rice, being some of the bigger crops that they would grow. Also a smaller population in the South, and kind of a rougher crowd, people fleeing debt, whereas New England in the middle oftentimes had more religious folk. So again, being able to identify one or two differences between those regions and maybe some similarities, always helpful. And then the road to the American Revolution. This is a little bit blurry because I had to steal a screenshot of it from the internet. The road to the American Revolution from 1754, let's say with the start of the French and Indian War, to 1776. You do not need to have to memorize all of these, but you should know maybe 3 or so key events that lead to the American Revolution. I'm going to list a few. I'm going to say the French and Indian War. That's important because it leads to a few things. It leads to England is massively in debt, and so there's a need to raise taxes. And then also, the colonies gain a lot of land to the west. So the big question as they start to expand is, well, Proclamation line of 1763 actually said that the colonists could not expand, which frustrated the colonists. And then you should know a handful of different of these laws. I mean, the Stamp Act is the famous one. It was a tax rather on all letters and kind of legal documents. You might want to know the Boston Massacre, where a small number of protesters were killed. Perhaps the Boston Tea Party, where the colonists dressed up as Native Americans and threw millions of dollars of tea into the Boston Harbor. You might also want to know the Intolerable Acts, which did a variety of things, but it basically said that the British Crown kind of tried to take control of colonial governments. And so the big idea here is taxation without representation. The colonists felt like they were having all of these incredibly high taxes. placed upon them by a king halfway across the sea, and they didn't actually have any representation back in the British Parliament. So again, knowing a few key terms, kind of having those ready is always helpful. Ultimately, the colonists win the American Revolution for a variety of reasons. First, they're fighting at home, so they've got kind of home field advantage, if you will. They know the turf. They're able to recruit larger armies with volunteers and whatnot. They also had brilliant military generals and leaders, especially George Washington crossing the Potomac here. And they also had support from the French. The French, Louis XVI, were bitter rivals with the English. And so they got a lot of support from the French, which helped to push them over the edge. So I might say something like the colonists win American Revolution because of great generals, home field advantage, and support from French. And then I'm just going to throw this term here, patriots versus loyalists. Patriots were people fighting for independence. Loyalists were still loyal to the crown. So you might want to know kind of where some of those different people were from. All right. Ultimately, one of the last things I want to get to here is the creation of an American government. And it took a couple tries. The first attempt to create an American government, the Articles of Confederation, failed. The Articles of Confederation was intentionally designed to be weak. It was intentionally designed to create a weak federal government because the colonists had just fought against the British, which was obviously an incredibly strong government. And so they're trying to avoid high taxes. They're trying to avoid kind of an absolutist government, which is what they thought they had with the British. And so the Articles of Confederation, well, first, Congress did not have the power to raise taxes. Now, again, the new Americans did this on purpose because they had just been paying all these high taxes. That's why they went to war against England. But it backfired because Congress doesn't have the power to tax and Congress doesn't have the power to regulate commerce. They're not able to fund the military and they're not able to build roads and kind of do normal governmental decisions. There was also an incredibly weak executive branch. And so even though their American Congress would pass laws, they couldn't enforce them. So we'll say that the Articles ultimately fail because they cannot raise taxes. There's no control over trade. And then also there's an incredibly weak federal government or weak executive branch, like a president. Which basically means that they cannot create an army and they cannot enforce the laws that they have. And so it took a couple of tries, but ultimately the U.S. Constitution has been around since the 1780s when it was ratified. Some key ideas of the U.S. Constitution. One of the biggest is three branches: separation of powers, inspired by Baron Montesquieu's ideas of the Enlightenment. The legislative branch creates laws, the executive branch, the president, it carries and enforces them, and the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, evaluates the laws and rules whether they're constitutional or not. Some things that you might want to know with the U.S. Constitution. Okay, you've got your three branches and kind of a separation of powers. You have a stronger president, but in theory they're balanced out. But then you also have kind of this bundle of compromises that was required to ratify the Constitution. You have the Great Compromise, which created the House and the Senate. The Senate was equal representation, 2 senators per state. The House was proportional representation based on population. You also have the 3/5 Compromise, which said that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for census, for population reasons. The South actually wanted them to be counted as a full person because they'd get more representatives. And then you might want to remember the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton, among others, wrote nearly 100 essays explaining why the Constitution should be ratified. And that ultimately brings us to the early republic. I'm going to focus mostly just on George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. We'll get to Jackson next lecture. So you should know a handful of key contributions for each president. George Washington, he really set the precedent for many things, including term limits. He only served 2. He set the precedent, for trying to avoid foreign entanglements. And so George Washington's farewell address is oftentimes one of his most lasting contributions because he warned against political parties, and he also warned against like foreign alliances, foreign entanglement. He basically said, we've got to work together. And if we get too involved with other people's stuff, or if we fight amongst ourselves, that's just going to tear us apart. That did not last very long because when Thomas Jefferson comes along, he basically creates doesn't create the modern political party system, but he creates the Democratic Republican Party, which in a very simplistic view believed in strong state government and a weaker federal government. John Adams, in between these two, was a federalist. Federalists believe in a strong federal government. And so Thomas Jefferson, perhaps his most important contribution, which is a bit contradictory here, is the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubles the size of the US buying a huge tract of land from France. It's contradictory because, well, that's the federal government making a huge land purchase, which is a little contradictory. We're going to pause here for now as we finish up period 1. Again, things that you need to know, and pause here to grab these notes if you need to. You should be able to compare and contrast Spanish versus British colonialism. You should be able to compare and contrast some of our different colonial regions. And then you should be able to know a handful, 2 or 3 specific events that lead up to the American Revolution. You should be able to know the weaknesses of the Articles of the Confederation, why it failed, and the strengths of the US Constitution, why it succeeded. And then maybe a couple key contributions from our first presidents, George Washington and skipping John Adams, Washington and Thomas Jefferson.